Good morning, good evening, good night to everybody around the world joining us now for the GIDE seminar. Welcome to our Digital Rules and Human Values seminar series, in which we explore the issues of a human-centric data governance and digital governance environment, with particular focus on people being empowered in their data lives. I'm very pleased today that we're being joined by Charles Rock. Charles is an old friend of the GUIDE initiative and is one of the fathers of, or parents might be a better way of putting it, of the internet in Hong Kong. He founded HKNet a long time ago, which was one of the first ISPs and operators in Hong Kong, and has been an internet entrepreneur for most of his life. He was also a member of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, representing the IT constituency. Charles is now a research scholar at Stanford University at the Global Digital Policy Incubator, and it writes extensively about AI and personal data. As is the mix and of the people who speak in this seminar, Charles is both a researcher and he's also a practitioner. So he's actually run businesses and formed businesses in this space. He's also researched and thought about it very carefully. So he's a perfect mix. And Charles today will be really speaking about personal data and AI governance as it applies in how he sees it in East Asian countries, particularly Northeast Asian countries, which we're looking forward to. We previously in these seminars had a lot of reference to Europe and the Atlantic, so this will be a good change. I would just remind everyone that we are recording this seminar and it will be later available in our series at YouTube. And we'll be sending around a link to the YouTube channel so that you can see the previous seminars. If you wish to ask a question, then put your hand up when we come to section question space. If you don't wish to be recognized by name, please send us a question through the chat list. And when your question, or if you want to ask a question but not have your image taken, just turn your camera off and then you can ask a question. Now let me sort of move on and welcome Charles. And he's now, I think he's at the office in Stanford.
Yes.
Be
yes.
great. So, Charles, we had quite a conversation about how you see the Northeast Asian environment. And I know you want to take us through some slides, which we're looking forward to. So why don't you get started and then we can start a conversation.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And welcome to everyone. And I do hope that we can have a bit more time in the end or toward the end, second part of today's session, that we can have more discussion and really want to hear what you think about what I'm going to say. But let's get started. Yeah, today I'm supposed to be talking about some of these data and AI governance initiatives, particularly in the East Asian countries. But before that, I want to quickly go through what traditionally and what's been happening in the last decade or so or more, the sort of what Professor Anu Bradford used to be talking about, the three digital empires, the three digital governance models that are most prevalent in the world: the United States model, the EU model, and the China model. The United States, pretty much, not a lot of regulations, focus on talking about market-driven and supporting innovation over regulation. Very much, I mean, I'm in Silicon Valley right now in Stanford, so the mentality is, don't stop us, from breaking things or trying new things. Any regulation is going to slow us down. And there are indeed a lot of very isolated and fragmented regulations at the state level, but at the federal level, basically either politically dysfunction or at the same time, obviously for this administration, there's no initiative. They're even trying to stop the states from legislating on AI and so on. And obviously, even if we go back to like good old personal privacy, there's no federal protection for that kind of stuff as well. So anyway, from the last administration to this administration, clearly we're also seeing a pivot away from, even talking about safety, where, President Biden, the last administration with his executive order, they did try to do something about that, even very lightly, but now they don't talk about it anymore. For EU, obviously, this is very different, since GDPR, which is probably has been serving as the gold standard for many countries around the world as the model of how privacy or personal data needs to be regulated. And then, of course, the EU moved on to other Digital Services Act, Digital Market Act, and so on, and try to, use the same kind of human rights-based consumer and personal privacy based and calling for democratic accountability in especially the platforms that provide service in their countries. So, of course, Professor Bradford's book also talked extensively about the Brussels effect, which, up to probably, 10 years or whatever ago, when GDPR first started out, there was this effect that because Europe is actually a pretty big market. So by virtue of having regulation in Europe, it does affect the rest of the world because many of these platforms, even if they are American or from other countries, they tend to say, okay, we have to accommodate Europe because they're a big market. And then we might as well make some of these regulations, follow some of these principles and so on. Now, with AI coming along, obviously, it seems like that certain countries in Europe are kind of thinking twice about it because they do see that in terms of, catching the AI innovation and opportunity and development, they are falling behind. So they are actually, some countries in particular, I've been hearing, for example, France and so on, they're saying that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be regulating so stringently anymore. Okay, and then China. China is obviously the other extreme, which means that they are pretty much singular control mentality by the party state. And it extends from ideology all the way to, many areas of industry practice and government control, including state-owned companies, exercising of surveillance and government monopoly or collection of huge amount of data, either directly or through these companies domestic to China, because don't forget, about 10, 15 or more so years ago, they pretty much driven out all the foreign companies from their market. So most to all of the major platforms operating in China are Chinese companies and they follow Chinese laws. So it's very much industry policy led kind of a planned economy. But these days, they are talking a lot about shared destiny with the rest of the world, and they are leaning on multilateral governance bodies, either from the United Nations and to ITU and many others, or the ones that they create themselves, to try to exert their influence of their models to other countries, particularly probably the global South. So let's talk about East Asia then. What are we talking about as in terms of a region? The three particular countries that I'm going to be talking about are going to be Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Now, they face many common challenges. Obviously, they are squeezed between two hegemonic powers, both geographically as well as politically, obviously. And and they obviously are the US and China. They kind of have to pick a side, or maybe they have already picked a side to kind of lean on more because of historical reasons, political reasons, and so on. But these three countries actually share some other common challenges or characteristics. For example, they all have a very critical role in terms of the global tech and chip supply chain in particular, if you think about it. Because when people talk about the chip 4 companies, when Biden was trying to, impose those export controls and so on, these three countries are included along with the United States. They are the chip 4, right? So they are very much dependent on American technologies and the market, but at the same time, they're also very dependent on the Chinese market and manufacturing, particularly more for some countries, less for some other. Out of these three, Korea is most dependent on the Chinese market and manufacturing, whereas Japan is probably the least. And they all are developing sovereign AI these days, and of course, this is not just East Asia, it's everyone around the world for cultural reasons, for language reasons, and for competitive reasons, and so on. But there are still a lot of cultural differences in terms of how they view personal privacy and legal enforcement and legislations and so on. We'll go into that pretty quickly. And the question is, do people worry more about these American big tech companies or their own governments? I personally am under the impression of the view that compared to the Europeans, the general public in Asia, including East Asia, they are less worried about these big tech in terms of how they control the data compared to they worry about their own government. Because many of these countries, maybe with the exception of not so much Japan, but let's say Korea and Taiwan and many of the Southeast Asian countries, they probably have a better and fresher memory about the authoritarian past of their own government as compared to, you know, how they worry about the big tech. That aspect is quite different, I think, from if you compare them with, let's say, the Europeans. And so, and then the question, another question I like to ask is, I ask myself is that what do East Asians or Asians actually in general worry most at night? Is it, you know, Facebook and Google getting all my data? I think they're more worried about cyber scam because it's crazy, it's rampant in Asia, and this is affecting everyone. That's what they most worried about, both from the aspect of their, you know, information and financial safety, as well as even personal safety, because you have so many people that kidnap over to some countries in Southeast Asia because of, you know, the cyber scam complex in some of those countries. Now, of course, China is also part of East Asia. They're the elephant in the room. I'm not going to be talking about them much today because otherwise, you know, we don't have room to talk about anybody else. So anyway, the other players or the countries or jurisdictions in East Asia would be Mongolia and North Korea. We're not going to talk much about them because I don't know enough about Mongolia and North Korea. There's probably not much to talk about. I mean, they're probably even more extreme than China. And Hong Kong and Macau, they're basically part of China, and more so now compared to before. Now, let's quickly go into Korea. This is an article that I wrote for Tech Policy Press recently about the Korean legislation. Let's not forget that Korea actually in 2024 hosted the second AI summit right after the one that was hosted by the UK government. So they obviously are very aggressive, trying to have a role to play in the global AI multilateral arena. Now, the Recent Basic Act that they passed, the AI Basic Act, you know, that's the full name I have listed on the slide. I'm not going to read it out, but well, you can see actually that they are talking about both development and establishing a foundation for trustworthiness, which means regulations. So you will see that each country are trying to balance between the two, more so than in the European laws. They don't talk that much, I think, I see, in the way that they're talking about we want to develop Europe as the leading AI power or whatever. That doesn't fall into the legal laws that they are writing. But you will see in these three countries and others in Asia, development is a huge part of it. But let's focus on the regulations part here, because actually, after all, in Korea, at least, this is actually the regulation part actually formed the majority of the law. They include regulating high impact AI, and they define a number of categories of applications that they will require human oversight. They also require companies to provide advance notice to users if they are providing certain content in their products and services with you know, they need to explain and tell the users that they are using AI, and a user protection plan must be in place. Again, many of these things, they're vague, and because lawmakers usually don't know what they're talking about when they're writing the laws. And then there's also the transparency requirement requiring, you know, labeling on AI output if they are difficult to distinguish from reality. So that's what they put into the law. And obviously, you know, having such a law, many of these private companies have been coming up and saying that, you know, how do we follow it? And then this is going to impact, you know, the kind of things that, you know, that we want to develop and so on. So so that's actually actually also a big part of the debate right now in Korea. And why are they doing this? I want to give you a little bit of background about Korea as well, in my view, because throughout the period when I was in the internet industry, we've always seen Korea as the pioneer in developing new regulations. And oftentimes they failed because they were among the first countries, probably even a little bit before China, setting up real name systems because they want to protect children when they are on these online games and so on. That's a good thought. But then soon enough, they lost all the information database. These companies that are holding all these real names of their users managed to lose them all to hackers. And then later on, they retracted the whole thing. And this is not the only occurrence. I don't have time to go into the details of these sort of mishaps that has happened. To me, this is because they have a very vibrant multi-party democracies. Lawmakers want to show that they are there to do something good for the citizens, and they put in these laws. And often, they also want to be the world's first, which may not be a good idea sometimes because you don't know what you're getting into. So that's the kind of tradition that we've seen. The other reason is also because compared to other countries, Korea actually has a pretty sustainable domestic environment for domestic companies using Korean language and producing content, their own search engines and messaging systems and so on, rather than just relying on the Western system. So they have something to protect in terms of being protectionist, and they sometimes do that. And so this is, of course, final word. Just like other countries, this is not the only thing they do. They also try to invest in the industry to provide, to produce new AI startup unicorns and so on. So let's quickly move to Japan. Japan, this is a statement that I found from an academic saying that the Japanese public are just not as interested in AI ethics and governance, and that the Japanese people are relatively more optimistic about the future social impact of AI technology than Western populations are. And I think this is not just for the Japanese. I mean, you've been probably hearing, yesterday, today is in my time zone, is the second day of the Lunar New Year, and maybe in your time zone it might be the third day, and you might have been seeing some videos of the Chinese Spring Festival, Chinese New Year TV show where they have all these dancing robots and so on. In Asian countries, in many Asian countries, it's more about believing in the technology and the goodness that they think can bring to them, rather than worrying about many of these backlashes and so on. That's, to me, is a common norm in Asia. And in terms of the government's regulatory push, they do want to target, and this is not just for AI, okay? Recently, in recent years, the Japanese government actually are pushing for regulations on, large platforms. Antitrust actions against Google because they want to protect Yahoo, because Yahoo, we're talking about Yahoo Japan, which is actually a Japanese company, not that American anymore. You just have the name. And these are actually more about competition rather than focusing, to me, rather than focusing on protecting data of the users on behalf of the users. They're more like about protecting data on behalf of the companies because they see that the American companies are coming in, maybe they think unfairly. Now, they take a soft law approach. The recent AI Act in Japan is pretty much really about setting up some of the very minimum legal requirement, and they only targeting something that they would talk about as the extreme high risk. It's not so much about regulation to me, about more focusing. If you take a brief look at some of the overview of the bill, it is more about imposing, we want to be competitive. We need more R&D. We need more education. We need to develop and attract human resources. It's more about that, than regulation. And also they put in Japan in particular, because in the past several years, within the last decade, through their work in the OECD and the G7, they actually have been taking quite a bit of leadership in terms of discussing these issues at the G7 and the like levels to promote global interoperability of AI governance. but still they're taking a rather conservative approach in terms of, compared to a heavy-handed regulatory approach. And they also emphasize a lot about cooperation with the US, much more so than, some of the other countries. So this is what I have seen from Japan. Now for Taiwan, the biggest issue I think that faces Taiwan is that, not to mention the geopolitical risk that they are facing because of who they are and where they are, they have a very checkered history in terms of data protection, even compared to the other two countries that I talked about. There has been widespread government mishandling of personal data because of their their own mismanagement in some ways, and also because of the weaknesses of their data protection regime and regulations. Before this, they didn't even have an independent regulator for personal data until just very recently, when a law was passed last year because of the lack of it, and the Constitutional Court in Taiwan actually mandated that the government has to do it within 3 years. That was 4 years ago, so they finally did it last year. So there were a lot of catching up that they need to do. But recently, they also passed an AI Basic Act in the Taiwan Parliament, and which is the legislative yuan. And it's basically about designating, okay, who in the government is going to have to do what. It's just about designating the authorities, like what they call the National Science and Technology Commission is going to be the central authority, and then the executive yuan, which is pretty much the cabinet, will set up a council, a committee, and the Ministry of Digital Affairs is going to develop the risk classification. That's it. It's not really much about adding more regulation onto the, if we compare what the Koreans or maybe even the EU has been doing. They are more interested in investing in Taiwan becoming an AI island. So they talk about, 10 major AI projects, and people compare that with the 70s when they set up 10 major construction projects. So to me, it is still a quite traditional thinking in terms of government industrial actions, policies, and so on, targeting specific areas of R&D and setting up R&D centers. I've seen this, the Hong Kong government doing it like 10 to 20 years ago, and look where they are now. So I'm not well, Taiwan is more competitive, right? They have what they have. They have the chip industry and so on. But I'm not totally confident that some of these development initiatives from the government is going to be enough. And okay, and there's also significant sovereignty drives in terms of digital and AI sovereignty. And they've developed their own government-supported LLM models, and they are particularly trying to focus on developing hyperscaler data centers and so on. But they face huge challenge in terms of the energy availability of that island of Taiwan. So this is going to be not easy for them, but so this is what they are. Of course, the idea framework, we're supposed to be trying to frame it back into, that discussion of where they are in these countries. And then what does that mean for the idea framework that we are proposing? So this is just a quick refresh of what this is all about. We are talking about giving more agency to the person, to the individuals, having control on their personal data, so that consumers, users are going to be able to collectively negotiate, and collective representation, and mandating maybe the intermediaries and these companies, platforms, to have fiduciary duties and so on. Now, this is all good, but as I said, if I frame it in the situation in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, and these 3 Asian countries, not to even mention about China and so on, and these 3 countries actually happen to be the leading liberal democracies. There are other democracies, but typically democracy scholars would probably mostly call many of those like semi-democracies in Southeast Asia. India is the biggest democracy, but I don't think we would consider them to be liberal in too many ways, and so on. So these 3 are the closest to the liberal democracy models that we see. But how close are they to the idea framework? While I think they do share some degree of similarity in emphasizing about balancing competitiveness and safeties. I think at this stage, the governments are really more engaged and concerned about falling behind than strengthening regulations and enforcement, with the exception of Korea, okay? But even for Korea, I think sometimes they're split between the legislature and the administration. The legislature want to do more to regulate because that is their job. They want to show people that I'm legislating because I'm a legislator. But then the administration actually is, in some ways, I think maybe a little bit want to, pull it back and make sure that they are also investing and giving the industry more ways to develop and innovate. So they're struggling with that kind of, finding the balance. So, and also how strong are these concepts about consumer rights in these Asian countries? And I have to say that they differ. For example, culturally, I do believe that Japanese are very private, but they value privacy a lot. But how do they translate into a form of legal protection and expectation that the government is going to protect them there? That's a different story. Taiwan is obviously a lot more behind because the legislative regime and the regulatory regime is just, unfortunately, still in the development stage after a long time. So the awareness is different. So that this is what I would perceive to be the difference between them and some of these Western countries. And again, many of these citizens in these countries do not completely trust their governments because of their recent authoritarian past. And this will be even more so if we move down Southeast Asian. So, Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Charles. That was encyclopedic and comprehensive as always, what we expect from you, a polymath who can really apply his mind to many aspects of this across the region. I was reminded when you were presenting this that one of the other differences is, especially in Northeast Asia, is the traditional way in which people think of government since the Meiji Restoration, starting with the Japanese and moving elsewhere. To a degree, government is about making me rich, and as a consequence, government is about I've seen it traditionally as government helping companies to be successful. So if you think of the rise of the Keiretsu in Japan, certainly Park's sponsorship of the Chai Bowl in Korea, Taiwan's had its own version of the same thing. There's sort of an attitude. I mean, one of the reasons Japanese savings rates are so high and traditionally been so high is that if you look at the big crises in Japanese history, big earthquakes, the fire in 24, even the war, government didn't bail people out. So it wasn't government for the citizens and here's the money to rebuild your house or what, after the earthquake. People save a lot because they know once a generation something bad's going to happen and they, the family, have to look up. That's why, again, families are so important in the region. The role of the government, people sort of accept, is to get businesses to work. No, it's a generalization, and you pointed out the limitations. But I think it's worth making that observation because it's a different history than you would get in other parts of the world.
Yeah. What you said remind me about the fact that many of these countries. I mean, it's not like people really love the big companies, and they think that they are to be trusted. I mean, the domestic chaebus and the karetsus and so on. In Japan, pretty much, I think the reality is that in the last 10 to 20 years, the big Japanese conglomerates have pretty much all faltered and they are not as powerful as before. In Korea, they're still big, like Samsung and so on, but it's not like people love them. People still hate them. They get into corruption scandals and all the time. But still, people want to work for them because they pay well. People want to work for TSMC because they pay well. Do they all love them? They're proud of them. Taiwanese are proud of them. But I don't think, it's like they think they all do the best thing or they trust them 100%. But the reality is they're the only good jobs. They're the best jobs. So young people want to get into that industry because they want to get paid well and so on. And they don't have it's very different from other countries that has a more service type of economy like Hong Kong or in Singapore. But that's getting us into a very different discussion.
Yeah. Well, I suppose one of the questions might come up later we may discuss is to be a devil's advocate to your proposition. all three countries have had to deal with the challenge of the rise of Chinese, well, like say all three economies, a more accurate way of putting it,
Yeah.
have had to deal with the rise of Chinese manufacturing dominance. And
Mm,
they've had the benefits of that, but that's certainly meant there's got to be changes in domestically. Some of them have developed service economies, but if the proposition is that personal data is increasingly an important part of the way the economy works,
mm.
and if liberalization mechanisms and empowerment mechanisms can end up with more economic opportunity, are these populations, especially take the Japanese who worry about their economic future because they get older, unleashing new markets in the services space, unleashing new markets in the data space as we enter a data world. Is that something that people will, if they thought about it, they're going to find appealing or they're going to be worried by?
I think they are. I think they are, but they are not very good at it yet. So that's the limitation. And these governments soon enough will probably divert more attention to the kind of things that they think they know about, which is like manufacturing, which is like chips, more on the hardware side, which all these three companies, as I said, had a pretty key role. And even for the chip industry, obviously they depend on China to different extent. Korea the most, Japanese the least, Taiwan somewhere in the middle. But still, for data, you will see that or service or digital services, all these three countries would want to obviously develop something better than what they have before. But I don't think they have been very successful internationally. Korea is more successful in having their own domestic platforms. Taiwan totally, they depend totally on American and even Chinese platforms popular in terms of digital platforms and social media and so on used in Taiwan. So obviously for Taiwan, the government worries about it. And that's why they are probably more aggressive in trying to develop their own AI sovereignty and their own domestic AI models and so on. But that only get them so far because I think they realize the importance of data, but the solution and the way to get there isn't very clear. And I don't know if they, at this stage, consider strong regulation to be the best approach. So they're still figuring it out.
Let's move to questions. Dennis Snow.
Extremely interesting talk and learned a lot. I'm very grateful to you for it. I've got
Thank you.
three questions, both sort of somewhat outside the framework that we've been focused on. The first is it's very difficult usually to differentiate between the gains from a big technological revolution and the market practices associated with that. So, with the early industrial revolution, there were huge gains, but they came with debtors' prisons and all sorts of market practices that we have since made illegal. But at the time, I imagine people would take the market practices as part and parcel of benefiting from the revolution. So if people were aware that they could have the benefits of the digital revolution and at the same time have more control over their data, more security, more privacy, less susceptibility to cybercrime, and get money for their data on the side, they would be surprised, and you wouldn't find that in the surveys. And my question to you is, could there be something to that? And if there is, how would one go about investigating its plausibility? And if you don't mind, I'll give you my other two questions because
Sure.
they're a bit related.
I'll try to let me try to quickly if I answer this, and if I didn't get exactly what you were trying to talk about, let me know. But I think they are. I think people are going. I think yes, people are becoming to be more aware of their own agency and the need to control their own data and so on. I do believe that that is true. But the problem I see is that, do they see that their government are able to be the effective enforcer of these regulations? Particularly for them, which is a common issue probably with the EU, is that these companies are foreign. So, and they are totally dependent on them. It's not like if you, I can use WeChat if I don't have my WhatsApp and whatever, but it's not an option for them, right? They're pretty much pretty dependent on the foreign platform with a few little exceptions. So I think the more important issue is that first, they're just becoming more aware, and whether or not they believe that the government has to show them that they are going to be able to be the effective enforcer. The laws and the regulations are going to be useful, are going to be, help them. While at the same time, I think these governments, to be honest, are oftentimes more influenced by the industry. Okay, I have to distinguish between this because I have been saying that the domestic digital services industry in these countries are not that strong. So in the reality is that, yes, actually, there are more incentive, as I said in the case of Japan, for example, of government trying to go after the big platforms, foreign platforms, more actively. So I do see signs of these happenings in some of these countries. Now, the question is, how do that translate to AI? Because they are followers. They are following what the Europe has been doing about the platforms in terms of, data leakages or data usage and data transfer. They're following that. But AI is new. And I think they're still under kind of the mentality that we want to develop our competitiveness first.
And the reason why AI is so interesting is because it is early in its development, and it will generate very similar problems of the sort that I mentioned to digital governance activities before. So my question, just in answer to what you've just said, is to what degree would it be useful for countries simply to piggyback off what the EU is doing in the AI space and others, with a view to not simply protecting consumers' rights, but creating a space where innovation becomes possible? If you've got a system of digital barter where you receive free services and give away information about yourself that you don't even know you're giving away, that's going to be extremely inefficient and inequitable. And to have just piggyback on a system that helps avoid that problem is something that might be useful, might be popular if people took note of that. But if I could go on to, if I could just go on to the second question, which is closely related to this, is it's difficult to imagine a different socioeconomic context from what we have. But my suspicion is that if we had a system in Europe and maybe a few other areas in which consumers exercise control over their data individually and collectively, both with regard to data that they generated and inferred data, that would be analogous to the creation of labor markets in the Industrial Revolution. That all of a sudden they have opportunities, and small businesses have opportunities that they would never have had before. And it's difficult to imagine this different world we would live in if people actually had this control, much as it was difficult to imagine what the effect of labor markets would be if most countries were still in feudalism and had indentured servitude, serfs. And so the question is, to what degree is the real challenge providing awareness of new scenarios in which our digital world could change radically if people had control and therefore knowledge of what the nature of the exchange in digital markets is. And if I could just sneak in my last question, because I don't want to go on for too long. It is possible to frame this in moral terms as well, where we're talking sort of purely descriptive terms. Is it popular? Is it not? But if you see the exchange of digital services for information under the floor of consciousness as something that is simply immoral, you're taking away things and people aren't even aware that there's a strong case to be made that regardless of whether it's popular or not, just like indentured servitude and slavery were just considered immoral after a while and therefore intolerable, we didn't have to ask how popular is it to abolish slavery. Is there a similar case to be made here, in your opinion, in the Asian context?
I think I'll try to answer all of these all together because I get what you were saying, and I think there is a good opportunities for all these, possible scenarios and, arguments to make people more aware of what they need to do in the new AI age because they're losing agencies and so on. Yes, I do think that, you mentioned about piggybacking and on the EU and so on. There is a good opportunity right now, I think, for the EU to go after these other middle players in other continents, not just Asia, but around the world, to say that maybe they should do something altogether because they need to un-American, right? Because that's the kind of the things that's going around right now. They need to an extent be able to, not completely depend on or follow the American way of doing things, particularly because America right now is being seen as, somebody that tariff them and do all these things that are negative to the, unfavorable to their own economy. So I think diplomatically, there might be an opening to do something like that. That's all I guess I can say about that. The other thing is, I think also to add to what you were saying about the problems with, making people aware of the kind of immoral exchange of digital services benefits to data. I think people are getting even more worried right now of the labor market because people are beginning to talk about all these white collar jobs are going to go away in 1 to 5 years and maybe even quicker, sooner, and so on. Now, whether or not that's going to be true or that kind of predictions, I think people are really going to become very worried. Young people are definitely finding it harder to find a job in any countries. So I think if you put all these pressure all together, there's an opening, there's an opportunity to make people realize they need to do something about their own agency. And it's not just about data, maybe that's too abstract, but AI is taking away too many things from people.
Paul Mullen, yeah.
Hi, so this is very interesting. You've outlined sort of 3 different models, in the US model where it's sort of corporate rights over data, and then the Chinese model where it's the government rights over data, and European Union's more towards personal rights over data. But then they're all competing with each other. So on what basis are they competing if they all have these different goals?
On what basis they are competing?
Well, they have different goals. So what is the competition at? Are they competing to have the biggest AI company, or are they competing to have the most government control over the data, or all these things?
I think exactly it's because the 3 governance models, they have different goals. The American model is pretty much like free market. We believe this is going to create the best wealth. Implicitly, they are going to be able to collect everyone's data from even foreign sources and so on. This will consolidate the American leadership and so on, right? So that's the American goal. That is not the European goal. The European goal is probably to personal rights. The Chinese goal is regime security, political control. So it's obviously, their goals are different. That's why they have
Yeah, so where does the
Yeah,
competition come in, right? Like, is the
the
competition
competition.
for
Yeah.
their sort of framework as to how this works? Is
Okay.
that the competition? Or?
There's some competition. I think the EU originally, if they are trying to protect Europeans, they are not trying. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that they didn't have originally about what, you know, what they're trying to compete. The US is obviously trying to compete for leadership or domination in terms of, the commercial aspect of it. China is also competing in the sense that they increasingly are developing these domestic companies that follow their model that they believe is going to be attractive to a large part of the world, including the global south, and other that would want more surveillance or control over, for political or other reasons. They find that to be pretty marketable. And so they would want to compete on that basis, both in terms of the market, in terms of setting standards, and so on. You see that Chinese very active in international standard setting bodies and so on to try to make the Huawei stuff to be the standard. So that is also their goal. And the thing that they are trying to compete, I see lesser that the Europeans, until recently, I think they're beginning to say that, of course, we need to have our own platform. We need to have our own AI models and so on. So they're trying to come into it. But yeah, I don't know if I fully answer your question, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, but what I got from that is they're competing to have their system in place, the one on which they're trying to compete. So the US is trying to compete on corporate dominance, and the Chinese want, government supremacy. So they're competing on their own basis and their own objectives. And so they're trying to have their own system in place, not only in their own countries, but also more widely.
Yeah. And today, of course, people talk about AI leadership, right? Everybody, mainly the US and China, right? So they want to be ahead of, the US don't want China to catch up, right? So that's another angle maybe to look at this kind of, competition, the philosophical or whether it's real or not, I want to be number one. I want to make sure I'm going to be way ahead of anyone else. That's the US model. We can argue whether or not China really wants to catch up in every aspect. That's another discussion. Thank you.
Peter, you've got a question.
Yeah, first of all, fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
As the other Paul said, you brought out the interesting comparators there between an emphasis on corporate rights, an emphasis on government rights, and an emphasis on personal rights. But I just want to be a little bit more positive about the possibilities of blending something together while emphasizing the role of intermediaries and so forth. And where I see the common ground is that you might have different drivers behind why you'd benefit, why society can benefit from a trusted intermediary model, but they don't need to always be the same. So, for example, in Europe, it can be driven by the emphasis on the enforcement of privacy. In Asian models, it can be driven by the emphasis on monetization, for example, which, from what I understand, people are much more accepting of the benefits of innovation over any relinquishment of privacy. So you basically say, great, and now you can monetize this. And similarly in the United States, although the emphasis is on corporate growth and greater innovation, it becomes a mantra. You can say many things about we don't want much regulation, but you cannot say, and the consumer doesn't have any rights. That's a different thing to say because it's all about consumer welfare. So if consumers want to use an intermediary model to maximize their own welfare the way they see it, albeit not in a data protection privacy mode, then we might be getting onto an area where we can have some common ground because, if you're the Chinese government, for example, you say, okay, the intermediary stuff can work at the commercial level. We can always interfere when there's a security concern. That doesn't stop that. Similarly, corporate growth, that's fine. We can't really stop, American consumers from monetizing their rights. If it's all about money, it's all about money. You can't say it's not about money. And then in Europe, I think there needs to be a cultural change there. People need to say, well, okay, I want to enforce my privacy rights, but sometimes I want to just monetize the value. If I don't think that the speed I'm going at in crossing the German to France border is important, if that data is anonymized, why can't I make money out of it if somebody needs to know or the average speed that you cross a border? So I think there's possibly some common ground that we can work on there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the biggest problem is the perception of the same term may be different in different countries, different cultures. So the education, the buy-in and so on is a process. And I agree. I agree. In the end, I think no one would want to give up something that they should have the agency of to others, whether it be a big company, foreign or domestic, or the government. I mean, I still think there's this shared value, but of course, the framing in different countries may end up to be very different. And that's why, there seem to be this big cultural difference. But I do agree. In fact, having all these platforms that are common globally is already making it easier to let people, from different countries' culture to talk in the same language because they're kind of using the same tools, right? So I do agree, it's a journey, but we may be able to get there. But the only problem right now, the biggest problem right now is there's so much uncertainty because of AI and where in some ways they may be providing a way out, or maybe they are making the problem even getting worse even more quickly. So that's the biggest uncertainty. But I agree. I think there's room, yeah. But a lot of work needs to be done, particularly in how to get these concepts into the people. Sometimes the government or the companies themselves may not be the best way to get these, awareness into the people in different countries.
Thanks for that. Charles, I wonder any sort of final comments you would make or any final observations?
I just want to make sure that we understand that I'm not trying to say that the goal is different. In fact, I think I agree with what Paul and the Guild and so on has been proposing for a long time. These are things that people really can agree among themselves. But the problem sometimes is, well, we all agree at the end goal, but how do we get there? So I think this is what the challenges in front of us. Government definitely will have to have a big role in this, but how do we organize the civil society? How do we make sure that this is multi-stakeholder effectively? That is the biggest challenge.
I agree with you. This is not easy stuff. If it was, it would already be in place. My final observation would be a reminder to everybody that historically and culturally, for the part of the world we're talking about, copying others is a positive thing. And if, they copied Western industrialization, I mean, you and I, Charles, how many times we've seen businesses all over the region where the first question is, what's the Americans doing? There is unique cultural and historical issues in their own countries. If they see success elsewhere, they often are fast followers of success. And so, we have a discussion going on, the perhaps overquoted Carney speech at Davos and other people's observations of the new alliances amongst people. And you mentioned the same thing.
Yeah.
In Europe, they're presently talking about an onion approach to political union, where some groups move first and some countries might move first. And it becomes clear in some places. I could see these countries, I could see them paying a lot of attention to success.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there might be an opening because of the way that, politically how the Americans are unfortunately, trying to have been doing what they are doing. And the other, are they going to have to get organized in other ways? So that might be an interesting new angle that has been developing because of what's been happening in the last year.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for a magnificent presentation and discussion. Thank you again for being part of the discussion around the sort of digital rules and human values that we're trying to explore. I remind you that this seminar will be available on a YouTube channel. You will find not only Charles's presentation, but all our previous presentations are on that channel. And I recommend you both make certain you revise those. If you've not seen them, have a look at them. And secondly, share them with friends and colleagues. So thank you again. Good discussion, and we'll talk again shortly.